let's start with willpower itself. So if it exists, it's thought to be, a part of a function of the prefrontal cortex. And it's, the prefrontal cortex is, part of the thinking and planning part of the brain. It's also involved in cognitive control, yet it's also the newest part of the brain. So it's the first that goes offline when we get stressed. So it sounds like with your patient, stress is a typical way to make that prefrontal cortex go offline. So it's not surprising that when she gets stressed, she struggles. Another aspect of that you mentioned was that there's some studies showing that the best quote unquote willpower is people setting up their environment so that they're not tempted. So you're even describing her doing some of that, which is generally helpful, but you're also describing the big place where it breaks down, which is, when people know, well, I could just get in the car and go. This is just like, my addiction clinic, when somebody has problems with alcohol, they don't keep alcohol in the house, but they have car keys. Mm-hmm. And there are liquor stores everywhere, grocery stores or whatever. So we can't, it's nice when it works, but it doesn't work when we're just really motivated, when our brain says, I don't care if you have to drive 20 miles, you're going to do it. It's amazing what people will go through. I've had patients who would smoke in the middle of winter when it was freezing, outside. They go through all sorts of links because their brain says, I don't care how tough this is on you, we're going to get my fix, whether it's nicotine or alcohol or sugar. So this sounds very familiar, and it's interesting that she's kind of highlighting a lot of these aspects. So, setting up our environment so that we're temptation free, helpful, but not foolproof. Using willpower, if we're Mr. Spock, great, where we don't have emotions. But I don't know any Vulcans that live on Earth, so
no.
Not such a viable option either, especially because that's the part of the brain that goes offline when we get stressed. So if we can understand those pieces, we can see why willpower isn't necessarily the best way to go. So what is the best way to go? This is where my lab's been studying, habit change, habit formation for decades, and it's really interesting to look at the most, where are all the pieces pointing in the same place? And the most evolutionarily conserved learning process and the strongest part of our brain is this reward-based learning system. And we've talked about this, the reward-based learning on your podcast before, so I won't go into the details. But just as a reminder to folks, it's so simple. It only has 3 elements: a trigger, a behavior, and a reward. And that importantly, it's that reward that drives future behavior. So it's not the behavior, because if we had willpower, we could just say, stop eating X, and we would stop. And then you and I wouldn't have this conversation because we wouldn't have anything to talk about. We'd just be talking about how great our patients were doing. So if reward drives behavior, because that reward says, do it again, do it again, do it again, we get stuck in those loops. Why not hack that system and use the power of reinforcement learning and kind of use that to subvert the dominant paradigm, if you want to think of it that way. So that's where we got really interested and said, could we hack the system? Can we actually hack the system? And we looked at reward value specifically. And so reward value is stored in a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex. Not that that's important, but for people that like to geek out about it, there it is. Yeah. And the orbitofrontal cortex seems to store a hierarchy of reward values. So, for example, tell me if your hierarchy is set up similar to mine. Broccoli, milk chocolate, dark chocolate, 70%, 85% with sea salt, add some almonds in there, something like that. It gets a little fuzzy up here. It gets a little, or more
vegan
nuanced.
Mint, the mint chocolate cookies from the little Girl Scouts.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
So the nice thing about that hierarchy is when given 2 choices, our brain, we don't have to go back and relearn which one is more rewarding. Our brain just remembers which it likes more, and then we just do it. Now that's really important because it keeps our brain's kind of random access memory. It keeps its working memory free to learn new things. So we can just say, oh, chocolate, I'll eat that over broccoli or whatever. So that's one aspect, is this reward hierarchy. The other aspect of reward hierarchy that's important to know is that these reward values get set up as composite values, as a kind of a mushing a bunch of values together. So for example, let's say cake, right? When we eat cake when we're a kid and we're at a birthday party, it's not just the caloric density, the sugar and fat content of the cake that sends this dopamine signal to our brain that says, hey, this is going to help you survive. Mm-hmm. But we start to link that with friends, with presents, with having a good time and all of that. So we store this whole composite reward value that gets chunked in our brain that just says cake, good, as compared to, well, you had a good time, you got this present, the party was, blah, blah, blah. All of that, just kind of the details go away. So I think of it as set and forget. You set the reward value and you forget about the details. Okay. On top of that, that gets reinforced every party you go to. So if you go to a bunch of birthday parties between, ages of X and Y, you're laying down that reward value of cake so that it's really, really strong. So that by the time we're, adults and we're trying not to eat cake, our brain says, oh, this is a no-brainer. I already know the reward value of this, just eat it. So we're really fighting against that. Our willpower is really fighting against something that has been reinforced over and over and over. And every time we eat cake after dinner, after a nice dinner, that gets reinforced, so it's like it keeps getting reinforced. So it's set up that way so that we can learn other things. The problem is that, we can't, we could probably subsist on cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner when we were 5, because we're out running around and burning off those calories. Not so much in middle age or whatever. It's a different story then. So that's when we started to run into trouble and we think, oh, I shouldn't be doing this, yet we can't stop. So how can we actually hack the system? The way to hack the system is to update the reward value. How do we update the reward value? One simple ingredient, it's awareness. So you have to be aware when you're doing a behavior to see, is this really, really, how rewarding is this, I should say. So for example, we have this app called Eat Right Now where we built in this craving tool. And the first thing we have them do is when they have a craving to eat a food, we have them open the tool and then imagine eating the food, right? And okay, what's it smell like? What's it taste like? What's it feel like in your stomach? And what that does is it kind of brings together the composite reward value plus their current physiologic status, right? If they're really hungry, that reward value, that craving is going to read out as even higher. And if they're not disenchanted, if they're like, yeah, this is a good thing, then they're going to say, yeah, I want to eat more. So the readout for that is we ask them, how much are you craving now compared to before you did this exercise? So that helps us establish kind of a current reward value brought together with their current physiology. Then we say, go ahead and eat the cake or whatever the food is, but we have them eat it mindfully. And this is really important. So we have them pay attention. And if they eat the same, if they're typically overeating a certain type of food, we say, go ahead and eat it, overeat it, but pay attention as you do it and pay attention to the results. And we ask them, how content do you feel now afterwards? And generally when somebody overeats, especially when they're not hungry, they don't feel good. Like their stomach doesn't feel good. They feel guilty about doing it. Maybe they get that sugar rush, whatever. But it's really important to line that up right there and say, look, this wasn't that rewarding. So all that takes is awareness. As they do that, that starts to establish a new baseline reward value because it drops if it's not that rewarding. And we just did a study in my lab where we found that it only takes 10 to 12 times for people to use this exercise to see a significant drop off in that reward value. And that actually predicts eating behavior.